All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are continuing to get caught up on all the Dawn of X stuff so we can kind of continue our coverage of Reign of X. I'll specify in the videos, like in this video, for example, this takes place before the events of X of Swords, right? So we'll make sure it's in the playlist adequately. And if you guys want to get caught up on our X-Men stuff and the upload schedule is kind of confusing you a bit, make sure you guys check out the playlist down in the description. That has all the X-Men stuff in chronological order. But just so you guys know, Marvel started the X-Men with Dawn of X, then they went into X of Swords or Ten of Swords, and now we're in Reign of X, and that's where all that kind of stuff is going on. So again, it's a little bit hectic. I'm trying to get caught up and trying to organize it as best I can because they're just releasing so much stuff. It's kind of nuts. But in the first video that we did, because technically we did part 1 of Wolverine, and all that really centered around were a couple different people. One was Jeff Bannister, then his daughter, who was basically dying of cancer, and then something called the Flower Cartel. And all we knew is that the Flower Cartel was basically taking the flowers of Krakoa that were capable of healing, different things like that, and they were essentially adjusting them and then selling them off, right? And the whole point was to basically make money. And we've seen that before, right? We've seen that in different ways. People taking the medicines of Krakoa and then repackaging them and then sending them off in different ways and making their own money and that kind of a thing, largely to people who live in countries where the government refuses to recognize Krakoa. And so as a result, they won't get any of those medicines and different things like that. So the result of this is that Wolverine was basically tasked with tracking down the Flower Cartel and ultimately figuring out what was going on. Now, the first thing we had really in the last video is you had what was called the Pale Girl. Basically this girl that seemed to work with the Flower Cartel that could actually cast illusions in people's minds and seemingly take over them. And what it did is it actually led Wolverine into a bit of a scuffle where it seemed like he was going crazy, and then ultimately rescued by Jeff Bannister, which really kind of leads us here. The big thing about this is that for most mutants in Krakoa, they don't trust people from the human race, right? They don't trust average humans. But Wolverine's been around the block enough times to know that there are humans out there you can trust. And even if you can't necessarily trust them, there are humans that you need. And Jeff Bannister is one of the good guys. And so essentially working alongside Bannister, who is a CIA agent, the two of them kind of start going through and trying to figure out what's going on with the Flower Cartel, find its location, where it is they're doing meetups, different things along those lines. And then in the middle of it all, Wolverine snaps and kills Jeff Bannister, or at least stabs Jeff Bannister. And I wouldn't go as far as to say Jeff's dead, but ultimately Jeff Bannister's more or less out of commission here. And the reason why is because the Pale Girl has basically arrived and taken over the mind of Wolverine. And so what this does is it leads to kind of jumping back to the day before, and you kind of have this bit of a conversation between Wolverine and Magneto. And the cool thing about this is Wolverine, one of the things he says is that given his life experience and the various things that he's done, that he came to this realization pretty early on that because of his healing factor, because of his adamantium, because of the fact that in a lot of ways his past is a little checkered, which is kind of an interesting thing. Kind of an aside here, one of the things that Benjamin Percy talks about when he's writing Wolverine, and one of the things that Wolverine mentions, is he doesn't fully remember his past. That's something that's kind of a return to familiarity, because if you guys recall, following House of M, one of the things that happened is Wolverine remembered his whole history. And so it seems like being reborn again or being brought back kind of resets him back to the version of himself where he doesn't know his full history. It's kind of interesting, a little bit murky. We'll probably have to just kind of wait and see how things unfold to know whether that's actually the case or not. But basically, Wolverine spikes the drink of Magneto. Now he does this in front of Frank Dukes, also known as the Blob. This is a big thing. And the reason why is because when it comes to the ruling government of Krakoa, Charles Xavier, Magneto, the other members of the Quiet Council, they're largely hands off, right? Mutants do not go after them or sabotage them or knock them out or in any real form or fashion show a manner of disrespect, because what that does is it undermines the government. And if people don't believe in the government, they won't believe in Krakoa. And so they would basically lead to the collapse of the mutant population, or at least the mutant haven as it exists in Krakoa. But for Wolverine himself, what he does is he actually steals the helmet of Magneto. And the reason why is because he's got a plan that when everything kind of pops off in this current moment and he ends up basically at least looking like he takes out Jeff Bannister and the Pale Girl makes her appearance, that is all part of the plan that Wolverine has for himself. The other follow-up thing he'd done after meeting with Magneto is he had actually gotten with Quentin Quire. Now the conversation between Quentin Quire and Wolverine is kind of a funny thing, because if you guys recall the X-Men in the mid-2000s, one of the things that Quentin Quire had done was actually use the drug kick to enhance his telepathic abilities, and then basically took over the entirety of the Xavier school, right? Literally led a revolt against the teachers, and it was pretty amazing. So there's a little bit of history here. And so right off the bat, Wolverine knows that Quentin Quire is not going to be interested in working with him, and that's when you get these Stepford Cuckoos, right? The young girls who are basically clones of Emma Frost. They call them the 5 in 1 is another name they refer to them as, but they're one of these groups where basically when they work in unison, their telepathy is exceedingly powerful. They do have it individually, but they work better when they're kind of working as a hive mind, right? So as the 5 in 1, they're greater than the sum of their parts is essentially what it means. But basically at the direction of Wolverine, they just spend a whole lot of time flirting with Quentin Quire, like, damn, man, we heard you were gonna go after the pale girl, Quentin. That's so sexy. That's so hot. Quentin's like, yeah, man. The funny thing about that is, in order for this deal to be made and in order for it to all go down, it's because Wolverine basically agreed to set up the Stepford Cuckoos with the guy they actually want, who's basically Cable. They want to get with Cable. But the reason why Wolverine did this, stealing the helmet of Magneto, working with Quentin Quire, is because he needs this whole group to operate at their full capacity in order to take out the Flower Cartel. That the pale girl is strong enough in and of herself, but one of the things that's gone on here is that it's the Russian government. That what had happened is the Russian government's kind of considered to be an exiled nation because they're a non-treaty nation. Seemingly, it can go a couple different ways. Either we can believe in the most ridiculous possibility, which is that the Russians have no treaties with anybody, or Wolverine's just using that term in relation to Krakoa, that they're a non-treaty nation with Krakoa, therefore they're kind of exiled away from Krakoa. But the whole point behind this is that what they've been doing is basically snatching up flower petals that are coming from Krakoa, and then in doing that, kind of repurposing them and then selling them off. And so to do this, in order to ensure they can kind of operate behind the scenes with seemingly nobody aware of what they're doing, what they've done is built their own sort of man-made island, right? Literally like a giant, submersible is really what it is. It's not really a submarine, but it's not really a ship. It's kind of this weird blend between the two. But basically, it seems like it operates in Russian waters, so they don't really have to worry about any kind of treaty violations against other countries. I guess they could do it in international waters, but doing it in the waters of Russia basically means no one can really do anything to them without potentially sparking a conflict with Russia. And so because of that, the flower petals are kind of brought back there and they do their thing. But Wolverine kind of shows up here with Iceman and with Storm and with Bishop and then with Pyro, and more or less kind of executes this mission, right? The biggest problem they have when they run into the Pale Girl is the Pale Girl seemingly takes over some of the other X-Men, or at least takes over Jeff Bannister, who's actually kind of recovering and is actually alive. The whole point behind this is that because Wolverine kind of cares about Jeff Bannister, and because there's a lot of history there, that ultimately he kind of backs off a little bit, lets the Pale Girl go, and then basically saves Jeff Bannister. Now, this is kind of a way for Benjamin Percy to sort of give us this idea that the Pale Girl is going to come back. The reality is we don't really know much about her. We don't really have a lot of history there. The only thing that we have, and I don't know if it's really even a clue so much as just the illusion that was being cast in the mind of Jeff Bannister, is he refers to the girl as his daughter. We don't actually know if that's the case, and Wolverine goes as far as to say, that's not your daughter, that's the Pale Girl. It could very well be that it is. We're not entirely sure. One of the things that goes on here is Wolverine actually gets this girl put on really taken off the wait list for medicine that can cure her, and then basically gives her the kind of meds that can, take away her cancer. Kind of the power of Krakoa. But it's basically sort of doing a favor for Jeff Bannister, right? Like, you saved my life, now I'm going to save the life of the thing the most valuable to you, which is the life of your daughter. Kind of a cool little bit of a favor there. Not only that, there's actually a little Krakoan gate that's left behind there, meaning, of course, Jeff Bannister is going to be one of these almost sort of Senator Robert Kelly type guys from Marvel Comics back in the 70s and 80s, where basically he's an ally to the X-Men, and he's in a pretty powerful position. Not the most powerful, but in a relatively powerful position. The problem is that where the day's more or less saved here on behalf of Wolverine, suddenly Krakoa is met by the arrival of Omega Red. And Omega Red kind of says, like, I understand that you guys are offering amnesty. Now, as soon as he appears, Wolverine's right on this guy, right? For a couple different reasons. One, because anybody who knows anything about Marvel Comics will tell you that ever since Omega Red's debut in X-Men Volume 2, issue number 4, like, him and Wolverine have just been fighting. And even before that, there's a lot of history. Like, despite that being his first appearance, Marvel came back and said there's actually a lot of history between these guys, and they've been fighting each other for a long, long time, and that Arkady Rostovich was like a murderer before he became Omega Red, that he's got a really dark and shady history, and Wolverine's been tracking him around for years. Now, the reality is, when it comes to Arkady, and this is one of the things we talked about in our video on Omega Red Explained, the only thing he really cares about is finding the carbonadium synthesizer, which will basically stabilize the carbonadium in his body, which is quite literally eating him alive. And once it's stabilized, he'll be fine, right? He'll kind of be able to be his normal self. The idea here seems to be that he needs the carbonadium synthesizer. He has to use it on a regular basis in order to keep his body in check. And that's usually how people end up using Omega Red. They're sort of like, hey, I have a carbonadium synthesizer, but if you want it, you got to go kill this guy here, right? That's usually how it works, where this character has kind of been a mainstay ever since the 1990s. But ultimately, Magneto steps in, pulls Wolverine off, and says, understand, here on Krakoa, there are no good guys and bad guys, right? It's simply just mutants as a whole. And unless they commit a crime against the mutant population, or possibly a crime against humanity that's done in such a way to where it presents a credible threat to Krakoa, they're hands off. You leave him alone. If he came here and said he's looking for for amnesty, you have to let him have that. And so ultimately, he's just kind of like, if you really want to find out what's going on here, if you want to know why it is that Omega Red's covered in blood, then some of it might be a lot of his own. Whatever the case is, your job's to go find out what's going on with him, right? To find out where he came from and why it is that he's covered in blood and that kind of thing, right? As a member of X-Force, that's kind of your job. And so Wolverine's kind of sent through the portal of Krakoa, basically back through where Omega Red came from, only to arrive in Paris, France. And when he gets there, he basically finds a truck, or at least a car, and his trunk is full of bodies, which is really kind of messed up and sort of screwed up. But as Wolverine kind of starts touring around and almost kind of investigating, is Omega Red really telling the truth when he says he's here because he really is seeking amnesty, because he's looking to turn over a new leaf and looking to become a good guy? Or is there some kind of ruse here? Did Omega Red come here because somebody sent him here, right? Is he basically designed to be a mole, or somebody designed to extract the other members of the X-Men and then dupe them into, basically being killed? And so as he kind of follows around and sort of follows this trail, he actually ends up coming across a woman bearing flowers. The funny thing is, we don't really know anything about her. Instead, he kind of descends down, or at least is kind of led down into this little bit of a underground club, almost something akin to a speakeasy, and then he consumes a drink and then passes out. And when he wakes up, he's strung up. Come to find out, he's in the lair of vampires. And the funny thing about this is that the vampires who are here are actually seeking to drink the blood of Wolverine for a couple different reasons. The first is because they're vampires and they drink blood. But two, the hope is that the blood of Wolverine would actually allow them to really benefit from his healing factor and then heal from being able to be in the sun. Because while vampires do have a healing factor, it's kind of this inevitable aspect of them as vampires that they can't exist in the sun, right? It's one of those things that Marvel sort of consolidates, and they say their healing factor doesn't quite work on that. And if it does, it doesn't work fast enough, right? That basically it's the amount of time it takes for them to die from sunlight far outstrips the speed of their healing factor. And so because of that, the hope is that they can use Wolverine's blood to basically heal themselves, or at least to be able to walk around in the sun. Now, of course, Wolverine breaks free, as you would expect. Louise shows up with a UV hand cannon, only to reveal that she's part of a group called the Night Guard. Now, this is a really important thing, because in Marvel Comics for a long time, all you really had here were a couple things going on. The first is that you had Blade, who hunted vampires, and two, you would have like the Midnight Suns who might come into contact with him. But the Night Guard is kind of this complement to the idea of Blade, not in so far as Louise basically says, yeah, like, I'm friends with Blade, we hang out all the time. It's not really something like that. It's one of those things where it's kind of like Blade's not the only one that fights vampires, that there are actual orders out there that exist that try to destroy the vampire threat as best they can. The funny thing about this is that when Louise brings all this information to his attention, what she says is, you'd have to be some kind of fool to believe that humanity are the only ones who are vying to bring down the mutant population. While the vampires are looking to do that, the reality is they see this as a chance to basically launch their own campaign. That the reality of what's going on is you as mutants have drawn the attention of the human world. Everybody's focused on you. And if they're focused on you, they're not focused on anybody else. So vampires are using this as a chance to essentially consolidate their numbers behind the scenes. And that these guys that you're facing off against, right? These enemies who are there, the reality is they're not the main force, right? The main enemy they have is basically Vlad, Dracula. That mutants have Charles Xavier, you guys are all united, and that's great. That humanity has its governments, and united is in whatever form you want to call it. Humanity doesn't really have like a singular leader. It's just a whole bunch of different nations that are all just kind of bickering amongst each other. But ultimately, humanity is really in a position to where they could fail here, that either mutants or vampires will likely win. Now, of course, this also brings into question the idea of like post-humans, those are the children of the vault, but not really anybody knows about that, right? It's kind of this small and hidden thing. And so ultimately, this is all kind of brought to the attention of the Quiet Council. Well, Wolverine's like, you guys need to be aware that this is something that's actually going on here. The Quiet Council does recognize it, but the Quiet Council kind of tasks him with, again, figuring it out and getting a more in-depth analysis of what's actually happening here. And so what Wolverine does is he actually ends up taking a kind of personal, or really a private portal that he has for himself to a place in the north up in Canada, because it's basically one of these places that he goes to for just personal solace and retreat. The problem is that when he gets into this bar, he's immediately attacked. And the reason why is because for years and years and years, while this bar had been a safe haven, the reality is there are people here now that have a vendetta against him, that have a grudge with him. Not only that, like once he actually goes to use the restroom and then he comes back, like there's this realization that somebody in the bathroom had basically been killed, that like somebody there was essentially destroyed. And the question was, who was it that did it, right? Who was it that caused this? And that's one of the things when he realizes it's basically the Brotherhood militia, right? Like Oregon years ago, that kind of a thing. There's a lot lot of history there. So when Wolverine's knocked out, what we end up finding out is the people who were here know that this is a bar that Wolverine frequents. And when he first showed up here, it kind of blew their minds. But the reality is they've all lost somebody close to them because of Wolverine. And so one of the things that happens, for example, is that with one of these guys, there was a fight in Madripoor that happened some number of years ago, and Wolverine was in the center of it. This guy's fiance was hit in the head with a chair, which cracked her skull, and then a blood clot killed her a week later. It's one of these things where it's kind of Wolverine's ghosts of the past that are coming back to visit him. The problem with this is they realize you cannot simply kill Wolverine. Now, you can decapitate him, and that'll be, as long as you keep his head separated from his body, then Wolverine will basically stay dead. The problem is, how do you cut through the adamantium bonding to his skeleton? That's not easily done. You would need special weapons in order to pull that off. The big thing they realize, though, is that while he can't necessarily die, he can be frozen. And so they literally just kind of like put him out there on ice, cut a hole in the ice, and then drop him in. And that's when Wolverine's like, look, I mean, this guy you're talking about in the bathroom, I didn't kill that guy, right? I'm not the reason why that guy's dead. And then as he starts sniffing around, that's when he starts to panic. And he's like, you guys need to get me out of here, right? Like, you guys need to let me out of here because something's coming for you. And that's when a head just comes flying across the air, right? Lands in front of these guys, and then they're impaled by basically a tentacle. And that's when we find out Omega Red is the one who killed that guy. Now, the whole thing behind this is that Omega Red was basically put to lure Wolverine out into the open. The question of why is something that we'd actually find out later. Instead, what you end up having here is just this kind of giant coming together of all these vampires showing up here on the scene. And that's kind of the crazy bit of a revelation here. The whole basis behind this is that Omega Red was basically a mole. That the idea of these vampires consuming Wolverine's blood for the purpose of trying to find a way to stay in the sun, that was the whole point of Dracula. That's what Dracula wanted. Dracula wanted the ability to walk around in the daylight, and Wolverine's healing factor seemed to grant the ability to do that. Now, again, under any normal circumstance, this would probably never work, but because Krakoa is so focused on humanity, and because humanity is so focused on Krakoa, it's allowed these vampires to kind of lay these plans and sort of allow these things to come to fruition. And so that's when you end up finding out that Omega Red was basically planted by the Vampire Nation. That everything from the moment when he showed up inside of Krakoa and said, hey, like, you know, I'm here because I'm seeking amnesty, all the way to this moment was basically designed for the purpose of allowing Wolverine to be drawn out so vampires could get a hold of his blood. And so what you end up having is this kind of dispersing. It's a little bit of an interesting plot thread. It doesn't seem like it's overly important, but basically vampires are beefing up their numbers quite readily, that they're going through and just biting all kinds of people. And in doing that, growing their numbers at a very fast pace. Now, the biggest question you probably have to ask here is, why isn't Blade responding to any of this? Why don't we see Blade dealing with this? Well, to that question, I don't really have an answer. You could say maybe he is dealing with it, but he's much like on the same path as Wolverine, where he's kind of figuring out what's going on. He just hasn't gotten as far as Wolverine has. But basically, these two unnamed, I would call them like lieutenants of Dracula, is really the best way to refer to them as, are just kind of letting all these people loose around the city of Minneapolis in the hopes that they will bite other people and those individuals will become vampires. So you guys see how it works. It's like a viral infection that if left unmonitored or untreated, it'll grow at an exponential rate, right? It'll just like literally one person bites 3 people. Those 3 people bite 3 other people, right? Like 3 people each, right? So 1 becomes 3 becomes 9, and it just starts going like that at an exponential rate, just growing rapidly, right? Everything blows up by a factor of 3. And that's just being conservative with numbers, right? What if that one person bites like 9 other people before they're caught, right? Well, then suddenly the entire world's overrun with vampires in a matter of like a few days, right? Like that's how fast these things can take place. Now, for Wolverine himself, again, still kind of encased in this block of ice, there's a couple of young vampire kids who realize he's there, and they're like, I mean, this is kind of interesting. I can't believe they just left him here. So they go to take him, and then basically Wolverine breaks free. But the funny thing about this is that unlike a lot of the other vampires that we see, they're not really looking to be villains, right? They're not really looking to go around and consume human blood. Instead, they feed on animals. Now, I know this seems like a little bit of a weird thing to throw in here, like why in the heck are we talking about Wolverine and vampires? One of the things to remember when it comes to like Dawn of X, Ten of Swords, Reign of X, this is all building to something, right? This is not necessarily written by Jonathan Hickman, it's written by Benjamin Percy, but the entire X-Men landscape is being monitored and organized by Jonathan Hickman. What this means is that this is all going to become important later on. Because say, for example, this giant war does break out between humans and mutants, then what if humans have like vampires on their side and different things like that. It's this just literal gigantic multifaceted war. It's one of these things where by virtue of the stories that they're telling and the allies that Wolverine's making here, they're stockpiling numbers. And so ultimately when the revelation is kind of revealed to these, at least, you know, to Wolverine on behalf of these young kids, that there is a desire by way of this kind of vampire nation to expand their numbers, then they kind of present themselves as allies and say, look, that's not really what we're looking for. That's not really what we want. We'll help you out as best we can. And so they literally help Wolverine topple a whole bunch of these different vampires and kind of stem this immediate outbreak. Whether or not we see another one unfold, only time will tell. But it's one of the things that they say that, like, the fact that they've been able to extract blood from Wolverine basically means they can use that blood, right? That they can go through and they can kind of bond it to themselves and allow it to sort of heal them, even if only temporarily, because they only have so much that they can actually use. And then in turn, expand their numbers during the daylight and the nighttime hours. And then at that point, once their numbers are large enough, then they'll be a threat and they'll actually challenge the mutant population. So in effect, what this says is that a war between the vampires and the mutants are coming. And that's crazy, man, because those guys can't catch a break, right? Either you've got the children of the Vault who are basically evolving humans in order to become like these almost godlike beings that are targeting the mutant population. You've got humanity who's targeting the mutant population just like they always are. You got rogue governments who are doing it. You've even got alien forces out there who are doing it. And now you've got vampires who are doing it, man. Like, the X-Men are just screwed, man. I feel like it was the worst idea of Charles Xavier ever to form Krakoa because they've done nothing but make enemies. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.